I think we'd like to get started because Bill has a great story to share with us, and so we'd like to give him the time to do that and have plenty of time for your questions and answers. I'm Susan LaPerla. I am the Director of Programming at New Canaan Library, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's special Authors on Stage program, which is co-sponsored both by Elm Street Books, our local independent bookstore, and by the New Canaan Historical Society. And they played an integral part in the research for doing this book. So show of hands for the Historical Society. Their mission now places research, preservation, and education as the Society's primary function. And they have a lot of the source documents and old photos of old New Canaan, so they have many, many good stories to tell and make available to people who want to know more about the history of the town. So this is a little bit of the backstory of this book. In 2009, while searching the internet for a property in Connecticut, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Bill Dedman went a bit off course and stumbled upon the subject for his next book. Just released, Empty Mansions is the fascinating story of heiress Huguette Clark and the sprawling 12,000 square foot New Canaan mansion that she never inhabited. And Bill wanted everyone to know that the book is now on the New York Times bestseller list, where it will be for the next several weeks at least. So congratulations to Bill. Bill is an investigative reporter for NBC, and in 1989, he received the Pulitzer Prize in Investigative Reporting for his work at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He got his start in journalism at the age of 16 as a copy boy at the Chattanooga Times, and has written since for the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. So please join me in welcoming Bill to New Canaan Library.
Good evening. It's good to be back in New Canaan. Sir, in the gray coat, blue coat, can you hear me in the back? You can. Good. You're going to let me know when you can't hear me. All right. Thank you. Good. Thank you to Susan. Thank you to the library and the Historical Society and to Elm Street Books. It's a pleasure to be here. We thought we'd be remiss if we didn't have events for this book in the cities that were important to the Clarks. We had 600 people last week in Santa Barbara, and we were in Butte, Montana this weekend, and it's an amazing place. And they ran out of books in Butte. You can't find the book in Butte. I think both books in Butte are gone. But now, my wife and I had moved in 2008 from Boston to New York City. My wife's a New York Times reporter, and she was transferred back down to the science staff. Her name is Pam Belloc. She's a science reporter at the Times, and she's been here. She wrote a book called Island Practice about a doctor on Nantucket. And we were shopping for a house. We were renting in Westport. We were trying to find a place, maybe a quiet street where our daughters could ride their bicycles. And even though prices had fallen in 2008 and 2009, it was frustrating looking for a house in Westport and Weston and New Canaan that we could afford. It seemed impossible. And as a distraction, I started looking at houses that we really couldn't afford. Got a little bit out of our price range. And I saw that I was looking at the houses that were at the top of the listings, and just for fun, looking up who owned them. Don Imus and Phil Donahue were trying to sell houses in Westport. I didn't recognize the name Huguette Clark, who I looked up in the town assessor's records, owned a property at 104 Dan's Highway. It was a steal. It had been marked down. It was at $34 million and was marked down to $25 million when I saw it. So I didn't know her name, so I was looking up the property. On the town website, I was just Googling that address, 104 Dan's Highway. And I found a zoning board meeting from a few years earlier where they were discussing a subdivision. And her zoning attorney told the town board, this property has not been lived in since this owner bought it in 1951. I thought, well, how could that be if it's worth anything like $20 million? So the next morning, I drove over to look at it. Many of you have seen the property. There's no buzzer, there's no name, there's no intercom. There are two tiny guard cottages, they appear, or caretaker cottages, behind a brick wall. I couldn't see any great house. The driveway went and curved through the woods. So I reached across the wall and I rapped on the window, and a man in his 80s shuffled out, "Your father." And I thought I'd read that section among others. Out shuffled an unshaven man in his white undershirt, a sleepy fellow who introduced himself as the caretaker, Tony Ruggiero. His son Anthony's in the front row. 80 years old, but muscled, he said he used to be a boxer and had sparred once with Rocky Marciano. But now he was watching over Mrs. Clark's house. He wouldn't open the gate, but he said the house, though empty, was well cared for. He'd never met the owner in his more than 20 years. All he knew was that his paycheck came from her lawyer in New York City. Ruggiero thought of something and ducked back inside. He brought out a newspaper clipping from the New York Post. An auction house had sold a painting for $23.5 million, Renoir's In the Roses, of a woman seated on a bench in a garden. And the newspaper said the portrait came from the estate of Huguette Clark. Ruggiero kept pointing to those words, the estate of. "Let me ask you a question," he said. "Do you suppose she's been dead all these years?" Well, Huguette Clark was certainly not dead. On the internet, I found that she had a second property, much nicer. This was not her best unused property. She had a nicer property on Santa Barbara, California, 23 acres overlooking the Pacific. At one point, she turned down $100 million for that property. The Shah of Iran tried to buy it when he was fleeing Iran. It was a potential site for the Reagan Library, but she wouldn't let anybody land their helicopters on it to look at it. It's on a mesa, hidden high above the ocean, and has been the subject of lore and legend in Santa Barbara for years. And the stories that were told, I read in an internet chat room, were that there were cars still in the garage from the 1930s, and that no Clarks visited, but that gardeners were still at work. I didn't believe any of that, but there are pictures of those cars in the book. So it turned out that she had a third property. Public records led me to Manhattan, where she had 15,000 square feet on Fifth Avenue. 3 apartments in the same building at 72nd and Fifth Avenue, 907 Fifth Avenue. Looking down on the conservatory pond where Stuart Little raced sailboats. Yeah, that's a true story, Stuart Little. It really happened, yes. So I talked to the doorman there, and he said, no, I think maybe 20 years since I've seen her. The elevator does not stop on her floor. So many of you saw, I did really a photo essay. 40 photos, a couple of thousand words online, raising the mystery, why are these properties vacant and where's their owner? It turned out that Huguette Clark was the daughter of a man who in the early 1900s was thought to be one of the richest Americans. The New York Times in 1911 said that if you count the money already in the bank, John D. Rockefeller is the richest American. But if you count the wealth still underground with his copper mines, W.A. Clark of Montana is the richest American. I didn't recognize that name. I didn't know any of his history. I'd like to just read one paragraph that describes W.A. Clark. W.A. Clark, an indefatigable worker, carried on at a pace that today seems impossible, especially in an era when travel was by steamship and railroad and communication by letter and telegram. W.A., by the way, was born in 1839. He was 22 when the Civil War began, and his daughter was alive in New York City during the Obama administration. During the first decade of the 1900s, for example, he maintained homes in Paris and Montana, built and furnished the most expensive house in New York City, constructed out of his own pocket a major railroad between Los Angeles Harbor and Salt Lake City, subdivided and marketed lots that became the city of Las Vegas, which today is in Clark County, ran streetcar and electric power companies in the west and a bronze foundry and copper wire factory in the east, grew sugar beets in California, published several newspapers, owned a bank with a good national reputation, was forced to resign from the U.S. Senate, then was reelected and served 6 more years, fought off a paternity suit filed by a young woman, a reporter, he had met at the Democratic National Convention, traveled through Europe collecting art, maintained good relations with his adult children, married a wife 39 years younger, and sired 2 daughters, all while in his 60s. So that was Huguette's father. Well, where was Huguette? Well, it turned out that Huguette had lived the last 20 years of her life in Beth Israel Medical Center, first in Doctors Hospital, then in Beth Israel, in New York City, on the Upper East Side and then downtown. She spent 7,364 nights in the hospital. She'd gone into the hospital when she was sick. She had some facial cancers, and she got those cleared up. And then she said, I feel more comfortable here. I'd like to stay. And she did. And they charged her only $400,000 a year in rent. She had last visited the home in New York, that was 20 years earlier. She had last visited in California in the early 1950s. Her mother was aging, and she'd stopped visiting, and then Huguette didn't go without her mother. And she last visited the home in New Canaan, apparently, when she bought it. She bought it in 51. She put on a 2-story addition, and then never moved a stick of furniture in. We'll discuss why she bought it in a little bit. Just a little bit about that property. As the years passed and the mysterious property remained unoccupied, neighbor children sneaked through the woods to peek at the house. And townspeople, some of those are probably here, and townspeople passed around legends about the missing owner. Her fiancé had built the house for her, one story went, and after he died at sea on the honeymoon, she couldn't bear to move in. You heard that one. Another story had Huguette's father paying the fiancé $1 million to go away. Le Beau Chateau has served for years now as an informal wildlife refuge for turkeys, deer, screech owls, barred owls, and great horned owls, goshawks, sharp-shinned hawks, and Cooper's hawks, an occasional bald eagle, yellow-spotted salamanders, rare box turtles, and red and gray foxes. Chimney swifts nest in the stacks. The caretaker's son rehabbed injured and orphaned animals, raccoons, cottontail rabbits, deer. When Huguette's attorney, Don Wallace, once came out for a tour, a goose named Curly untied his shoes. The only personal touch in the 22 rooms is in the wing Huguette had constructed in the early 1950s. A graceful wooden staircase leads from the 1,300 square foot bedroom up to a loft, a painter's studio, with sinks for washing brushes. That's not a typo, it is a 1,300 square foot bedroom. On the staircase, every other baluster holding up the handrail is hand carved in the shape of an artist's brush. So what was up with Huguette? I was lucky to be introduced to her cousin, who was a much better investigative reporter than I had ever thought to be, because he had looked her up in the telephone directory. It turned out that she was in the directory in Santa Barbara. He spoke to her estate manager there, then wrote to her, care of her attorney in New York, and he then spoke with her over the phone over a period of 9 years. They had about 50 conversations. Some of those conversations he taped, and you can hear in the audio book. I don't mean a Nook or a Kindle electronic book, but I mean you download from iTunes or Audible the audio version of the book, and you can hear their conversations, and you can make up your own mind about Huguette's state. I'm going to play for you just a bit of an answering machine message from her. Let me see if I can get the sound up to the right level. And if it starts out badly, we'll restart it. She wouldn't leave him a phone number. She didn't. She never told him that she was in the hospital. He would write to her at 907 Fifth Avenue or through her attorney, and eventually they worked out a system where he would call the attorney and say, I'll be available at this time, and then she would call her cousin at the appointed time. And that's how they carried on their conversations for years. She knew that he was her nephew, was her cousin, but she asked him to call her Tante Huguette, or in French, Aunt Huguette. She felt, as she was much older than he, and she felt more comfortable with that title. Let's see if we can play this.
Oh, this is your Aunt again, and I did call the other number, but I didn't get an answer. So I'm leaving, but I'll call you up soon again, because just now I have chicken pox of all the things to get a hold of at my age, imagine. So anyway, but I'm getting along fine. The fever went down and everything's okay. And much love, and thank you for the pictures. Your daughter's beautiful, and your little grandson is adorable. Your little grandson, Eric. And
At that point, the message timed out. One thing she had failed to mention again was her telephone number. It took him another year before he was in conversation with her. Could you hear that in the back? She's saying, I called, I tried your other number, I didn't get you, I'll call back. And, you know, just now I have the chicken pox, of all things to get at my age. She was in her late 80s at that point. And, but her fever's gone down, she's feeling much better, and thank you for the pictures you sent me, and your daughter's adorable, and your little grandson, Eric, and then the message timed out. Huguette turned out to be a shy, quiet artist, a painter, a lover of fairy tales, a collector of dolls, a builder of dollhouses, a designer of Japanese buildings, model tabletop buildings that she had an artist wandering all over Japan to make exact in their measurements. She had her artistic pursuits, and she had very little interest in being out. Her relatives, who we'll talk about in a few minutes, members of her family outside her immediate family last saw her in 1957. Most of her relatives had never met her. Here's a little selection of that deals with a bit of what Huguette was interested in. The House of Christian Dior held fashion shows at the palatial French consulate in New York, just up Fifth Avenue from Huguette's apartment, with models showing the latest Parisian fashions. On the afternoon of one of these shows in the late 1950s, a familiar name showed up on the list. "Mrs. Huguette Clark," exclaimed the Consul General, Baron Jacques Baines, who had married Huguette's niece. "Look," he said, "she's not going to come. She's my aunt, and she never goes out." The representative from Christian Dior replied, "Oh, yes, she will. She wants to see the dresses for her dolls." And she did. Huguette, just past 50, walked the 3 blocks up Fifth Avenue to the consulate to view the latest fashions from Paris. Margaret, where did you go? Yes. Margaret's father worked at French and Company in New York City and repaired and acquired and fixed furniture for Huguette for many years. She would call the house relentlessly asking that he come down and make further repairs. She also was really more interested, I think, in the smaller furniture in her doll houses. And I'd like to describe for you Huguette's generosity to a family of a man named Rudolph Jacklish, who fixed her doll houses when they needed repairs. And they always needed repairs. I spoke to grandchildren of a caretaker for Huguette who were given a wonderful dollhouse, and it was with them for a couple of weeks, and then it went away. It went back to Germany because Huguette had decided that the floors needed to be refinished. But then it came back. Rudolph's daughter I spoke with said it bothered Huguette terribly if the measurements in the doll houses were not right. She liked to place dolls in the houses and move them through various activities. Sometimes, however, the ceilings in the houses were too low for the dolls. One time, Huguette called Rudolph with an urgent problem. "The little people," she said, "are banging their heads." Now, so I've told you she doesn't go out of the house, and I've told you that she plays with dolls, and you've now developed a certain image of your quiet neighbor, Huguette Clark. She studied Japanese history intently for her paintings, which she worked so hard to get all the details right of the hairstyles and the kimonos. She corresponded with professors in Japan to get the Japanese names right that she would put in the corners of her paintings. She was an avid amateur photographer. I've seen her photos where she writes the f-stop and all the lighting settings and the camera settings on the back of the images. She learned to play chess in her 80s. She wrote marvelous letters. In all her conversations, her cousin Paul, my co-author, Paul Clark Newell, Paul said if there was any indication at all that she had any disability, she hid it very well. I knew that she was reclusive, he says. I knew that from our family history, but she was so comfortable on the phone and so open, even telling him she had chickenpox before she'd met him. They chatted about family matters. She knew who her relatives were. She'd see a picture and she'd say, "Oh, John doesn't look well." She was normal in every way. And her memory was terrific. Her short-term memory, she recalled that he had said his granddaughter was taking ballet lessons. And her long-term memory, very long-term, she described to Paul how her father had shown her and her older sister which staterooms they were going to sleep in a new ship making its second voyage across the Atlantic. That's the RMS Titanic. They had tickets on the Titanic, and as she explained to Paul, and you can hear it in the audiobook, well, no, that boat sank, so we had to take a different boat. When Paul misremembered the name of a hotel at Waikiki Beach, she corrected him and named the hotel she'd stayed at in 1915. We should all hope to be that clear at age 100. So Huguette was, a word she liked to use, peculiar. She hadn't gone out of the house much since the 1950s. We know she went out in the 60s to get her Stradivarius violin restrung. She collected fine paintings, Monet, Manet, Cézanne, and fine musical instruments. And she was relentlessly generous. As we were working on this book, I was trying to piece together what sort of person she was and what sort of person her father had been and her mother. You know, in a way, it felt like an experience I'd had when my grandmother died. She's from a small town in Middle Tennessee, and when my grandmother died, I guess I was in my 20s, and we're cleaning out her attic for a sale. And I'd been in the house hundreds of times. But up there in the attic, I was learning a lot more about her. There were hats, great hats from the 40s. There were the love letters that she and my grandmother had written to each other during World War I. There was the ledger book where she was recording, saving up money to buy one new piece of furniture each year for the house, including the dining room table that we'd sat at all my life. That's now in my son's house. And so it felt like from her, what she wore, what she bought, what she wrote, what she listened to, what she read, it felt like we were piecing together a picture of her that added to what I knew about my grandmother. And this effort about Huguette felt like that. I'm a public records reporter, I'm a digger for documents, and so we ended up with, largely because of the legal proceedings after she died, we ended up with the testimony of 50 witnesses who knew her, 20 years of medical records, including daily notes for 20 years by the nurses. We know that she read the New York Times and listened to CNN and listened to radio. We knew some of that from Paul's conversations. She would call and say, I understand there are wildfires in your area. Are they near your house? She knew when the NASDAQ was up or down. She knew about Monica Lewinsky or Elliot Spitzer and whatever was in the news. But it felt like we were piecing her together from the public records and from her private correspondence. I was able to get, not all of her papers, but 20,000 pages of her correspondence, including 4,000 pages in French. Guiane, please wave your hand. Translated 4,000 pages in French, from French to English for me. And I think what we pieced together that Huguette was quite competent, but she was sentimental. She told Paul that she couldn't go back to her home in California because it reminded her of her mother and made her sad. And she couldn't get rid of it because it reminded her of her mother and she couldn't let it go. She'd bought the house in New Canaan as a refuge. Her mother had bought a ranch in California after the Japanese had bombed an oil refinery near Santa Barbara where they had a house. Her mother had bought a ranch. And it seems that Huguette, similarly, during the Cold War, bought the property in New Canaan as a place that she, but particularly her staff, could flee to if necessary from New York. It was just a spare, a refuge. And that's why it wasn't about the fiancé. She'd had a brief marriage, no children. But I was surprised that Huguette, with her reputation for reclusivity, had carried on such a long, vibrant correspondence. She was a collector of friends and a maintainer of friendships for decades. 40 years after she divorced, 40 years after, as she told her nurse, on the honeymoon I had to go home, and who hasn't had that feeling? She 40 years later was corresponding with her ex-husband, sending him family news and consoling him on the death of his dog and asking that he come visit when she's in New York, and sending him money as she sent everybody money. It turned out that she had a boyfriend in France with whom she maintained a correspondence for, as he put it, half a lifetime. I'd like to read for you a short section that I think bears on the question of lucidity, and then we'll talk a little bit about the legal goings-on after you get died. There was recently a settlement in her case in the estate battle for her money. We'll discuss that in a minute. But this doctor would have been a key witness. It was October 25, 2005, 6 months after Huguette signed her last will. On that Tuesday morning, notes in her medical chart showed her to be in an acute confusional state, delirious, agitated. She was hearing piano music. A stroke was possible. Her doctor called for a specialist. In her more than 10 years working at Beth Israel Medical Center, Dr. Louise Klebanoff had heard of the little old lady who lived in the hospital. Now she was meeting her. The neurologist nudged 99-year-old Huguette awake from her morning nap. The patient opened her blue steel eyes, seeing an unfamiliar face. "Leave me alone," Huguette said irritably in her high French accent, and closed her eyes. The doctor studied the chart and looked closely at the white-haired woman. Weighing barely 85 pounds, she was dressed in a housecoat and 3 white cashmere sweaters. And she had surprisingly soft, girlish skin and rosy cheeks. Skilled at cajoling older patients, Dr. Klebanoff gently persuaded Huguette to wake up and to play along with her mental status exam. She tickled her to test her sensory reactions. She gave her simple commands: close your eyes, hold up your arms, wiggle your fingers. Huguette complied, and the doctor moved up to more complex commands. Clap your hands 3 times and stick out your tongue. "Leave me alone," Huguette shouted, pulling the covers over her head. This turtle wasn't coming out of her shell. Dr. Klebanoff said she'd come back tomorrow. The next morning, Huguette brightened up immediately when she recognized the smiling doctor. She sat up in bed and stepped through the tests with ease. She knew who she was and where she was and when it was. Huguette was very hard of hearing, but she was attentive. Her speech was clear, her reflexes quick. She was normal in every way, neurologically. She seemed, Dr. Klebanoff said later, cute as pie, perfectly content. Huguette just had a cold, the doctor wrote on the chart, and was dehydrated, causing a temporary electrolyte imbalance, which can bring on confusion or hallucinations. With her fluids back to normal, she was fine. The women talked on for another 20 minutes. Huguette gave the doctor a tour of her tabletop model castles from Japan with their brocade fabric interiors. She took out her photo album. Here was her dear mother, smiling shyly in an elegant French summer dress. Her dear father, the Copper King, looking proud in his dandyish white suit. Her dear sister with her bicycle in front of the family's summer castle outside Paris. Huguette showed the doctor her California house, a palace on a cliff by the Pacific, and her father's house, the largest in New York City, Huguette's girlhood home, with a tower and 121 rooms, including one adorned with gold. Taking all this in, the neurologist wasn't exactly sure how much to credit this tale of gold and copper, of kings and castles. What did it indicate about the patient's neurological status? Dr. Klebanoff turned to the nurse and asked in a stage whisper, "Is any of this true?" "Oh, yes," the nurse said. It's all true. And it was. Let's have a show of hands. Your choices are elegant and creepy. Who thinks dolls are elegant and you'd like to have antique dolls that cost $14,000 a throw? And who thinks dolls are a little creepy? Yeah, okay. My wife says, if you show me those dolls again.
Yes,
So,
it shouldn't be in good condition.
well, I understand it is.
I'm going to show you Huguette's doll collection. You're hearing Huguette's Stradivarius violin being played. It says she died with 1,157 dolls, mostly antique Japanese and French dolls. She bought these two dolls for $14,000 apiece on the same day at Sotheby's. These next photos are not as high quality as that. They're from her own snapshots. These French dolls are a couple of feet high, but she had a lot of antique Japanese dolls that are called hina dolls, ceremonial dolls, and these are very small, 3 inches approximately, 4 inches. And these are buildings that Huguette designed. These are fairy tale doll houses. This is Rapunzel coming up on your left with her hair let down. These are doll houses that were made for Huguette by a woman in Germany. They're doll houses, but they have scenes from fairy tales painted on the walls of them, so they're sort of sets as well. These are accessories for doll houses. Carefully arranged on the shelves of her apartment by her personal assistant, who got a history degree from Fairfield University and then found himself enrolled in the Huguette School of Dolls and Japanese History. And he would begin his day walking her 42-room apartments to make sure the paintings were all there. And then he would bring to her in the hospital room whatever she wanted for that day. She'd call him and say, "Oh, can you give me that book on Japanese history? This is the name of it. It's on the top shelf. I think it's the 7th book on the right. And would you bring that over?" Her best friend, Suzanne Pierre, said, "I'm not really her best friend. Her dolls are her closest companions." This is Huguette on the porch of her father's house when she was 4 years old with her doll collection. This describes the legal settlement, which we'll discuss in a moment. Do you mind turning the lights back up for me? Oh, I'm sorry. Before you do that, I might as well just show you the entry to the house here in New Canaan, which she called Le Beau Chateau. I thought some of you have been there. There was a fundraiser a couple years ago for theater. Some of you have been. And others have snuck through the woods through the years. Yes, past the old tennis court. But I thought I'd just show you what it looks like to drive onto the property. If you look closely, you'll see a couple of deer cross the road ahead of you. There goes one. And there goes the second one. We had to very carefully time letting them out of that box. If you haven't been there, there's a little glimpse of what it's like to visit. Thank you. Could you turn the lights back up for me? Thank you. I'd just like to take a minute to describe what happened after Huguette died. I wrote stories in 2010, and then those developed into a criminal investigation because some information came out about the men who were managing her money, and many of you remember these stories. Her accountant turned out to be a felon and a registered sex offender, and many things that she owned had been sold, and that raised suspicions. This house was for sale. A Renoir had been sold. The Stradivarius had been sold for $6 million. And certainly for me, and I think for the district attorney in New York City as well, this raised the possibility that what we had here was some sort of case of elder abuse of a woman who had secluded herself away and had therefore made herself vulnerable to being taken advantage of. I don't think that happened at all. The district attorney filled a room with her financial records and had 2 police officers and a forensic accountant, and what they came up with was nothing. She had written checks making very lavish gifts, perhaps unethical to receive them, but not illegal. She'd given $31 million to her nurse. Her nurse had worked for her for 20 years. For many of those years had worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. Huguette lavished on her the money to buy 6 different houses, gave her her second best Stradivarius, gave her a Cezanne painting. It all added up eventually to about $31 million. The attorney didn't take anything. The accountant didn't take anything. She authorized the sale of these properties to raise money to give more gifts. I thought that Huguette's generosity was one of her most compelling characteristics. Just one example. I spoke with a woman who had been a home health aide for a stockbroker in New York. Every day she would take buses and trains to get into Manhattan to take care of him, and he had died. And she was now back home in Queens at her home when there was a knock on the door and a man showed up and said, "Hi, you don't know me. I'm Don Wallace. I'm an attorney. And you don't know my client either, but I have a letter for you. And if you promise never to tell anybody who gave you this letter, I'll let you see it." And she thought she was on candid camera. And she said, "Okay, I go to Bible study every Wednesday night. I swear I won't tell anybody." Her name is Gwendolyn Jenkins, and I talked to her. And she said, "I was telling my daughter that night, what an amazing person. I didn't know this woman. I'd never heard her name. She was just a client of this stockbroker. And she had heard that I had been a faithful home health aide taking care of this man before he died." And she sat down, she was then in her 80s, and wrote me such a nice card on floral paper and thanked me for having taken care of poor Mr. Irving. And can you believe it, she told her daughter, she enclosed a check for $300. Can you believe that? And her daughter said, "Mother, you'd better sit down. This is a check for $30,000. And she used that money to buy a retirement home outside of Atlanta, where she still is. If I hadn't had a copy of the canceled check, she wouldn't have discussed it with me at all, and she still refused to say the name of who had given her the money. She said she still had this letter in her hosiery drawer in her bedroom. Huguette's generosity extended. I'll just give one more example. She had a boyfriend in France, and his family she was very generous to through the years, down to having an account at the grocer near their house in a little town in Normandy. You remember these cables? And she would telegram to the grocer, listing items to buy for the family, milk and little chocolates. And you remember S&H green stamps? Well, they had some equivalent, the collector stamps there, and she would list all the items to buy, and she said, and make sure that they get their collector stamps, make sure that so they can save a few dollars. So after Huguette died, her relatives went to court to challenge her will. Huguette, in short, had left the largest bequest, the house in California, to a new foundation to be established for the arts there, called the Bellasguardo Foundation, named after the name they gave to the house there, called Beautiful Lookout. And she left $500,000 to the attorney, $500,000 to the accountant, $1 million to her hospital, Beth Israel. They must have been terribly disappointed. The president of the hospital had come to sit with Huguette. The president of the hospital's mother had come to sit with Huguette. And out of more than $300 million, they got one. She had a goddaughter in Massachusetts who'd written her kind letters, even though she'd last seen her in the 50s, and respected her privacy and didn't press to visit, but she was in the will for a substantial sum. And the nurse was in for what works out to be about another $15 to $30 million. So there's a paragraph in the will that specifically says, I leave nothing to my family with whom I have no connection. What family? Well, these are descendants from her father's first marriage. So to Huguette, these are half great-grandchildren, or grandnieces and nephews. And their claim was, she's mentally ill, of course, because she's not using her properties. And she plays with dolls. So she can't know the value of her money that she's leaving to anybody. And she's being defrauded by the nurse and the attorney and the accountant. That's their claim. So a trial was scheduled in September, and the case was settled on the eve of trial, and many of you have read about that. And the way the settlement worked out is this. The state attorney general in New York was very concerned about the gifts to the people in confidential relationships, the nurse, the attorney, and the accountant, and kept them from getting any more. So the attorney doesn't get $500,000, the accountant doesn't, and they don't get to be executors either, so they lost $3 million apiece in that deal. The nurse not only does not get any more, she had to give back $5 million of the $31 million she'd previously gotten. She's fine. She still has a Bentley, which in her deposition she complained is not a very convenient car in Brooklyn. The world's fastest four-door sedan, she said, you're always just afraid somebody's going to bump into you. The goddaughter got much of what she had been left. Various other employees got what they'd been left. And the biggest beneficiary remains a new foundation to be established in California at her mother's house to foster the arts. That's a rather vague description, and there's a board to be set up, and they'll have to decide what that means, and it may be that at some point you'll be able to go visit Huguette's doll collection and her paintings at the house in Santa Barbara. So the dolls are going there. I suspect they'll sell many of the dolls and keep a few. Because this new foundation is going to be house poor, it's got a property worth $85 to $100 million, but it may have only a few $1 million to start out with, and it will have to raise money to survive. And where did the rest of the money go? Lawyers and taxes, yes. In the settlement, the lawyers got about $25 million. for their efforts, and the taxes and her back gift taxes and penalties and interest on that ate up a lot. So you end up giving away about a third of what she had at the time that she died, between a third and a half. Now, I'm going to take some questions. Some of you may have questions about the New Canaan house, about Le Beau Chateau, as she called it, the beautiful castle. I'm going to play the photos that are in the book and let those spin while we deal with questions. And then I'll have a few brief announcements at the end, and then I'm going to sit and sign some books and talk with anybody who wants to talk. But we have a few minutes. Some of you may have just experiences that you want to share with everybody, or you may have a question. If you're going to do more than just ask a brief question, come up here and talk into the microphone. Yes, sir.
Where did the sister end up?
Well, her sister was 4 years older than you get, and died young. But the sister died of meningitis just before her 17th birthday. And that brings to mind a choice that we made in writing the book. This is a book of nonfiction. It relies on the testimony and the documents and her correspondence and the photographs. And we were careful not to make up any dialogue, not to put thoughts into anyone's head, not to create anything that we couldn't document. I'm a stickler for that. Every time NPR says, oh, and Americans believe that the Syrians, well, sorry, among the things that we can't prove would be what the CIA believes. We can never say as journalists what someone thinks or believes or feels. It's not verifiable. That belongs on the fiction shelf. We can say what people do and what they say they feel or believe or think. And we were careful not to try to psychoanalyze Huguette. It was clear that she was lucid. There was no doubt of her lucidity if you read her correspondence or hear her on the phone. But why was she peculiar? Why was she shy? Why was she withdrawn? Or why did she not do well with strangers or new people? We didn't offer a guess as to why that was. I am confident that easy explanations fail. Oh, her sister died, or oh, it's because she was so wealthy, or it's because she was afraid of kidnapping. I mean, she had fears, there's no doubt about it. Her friends in France said, why can't you come visit? Why don't you come visit us again? And she said, oh, I couldn't do that. They might have another revolution. So the French Revolution was on her list of fears. And she didn't do well with strangers or even people she knew well. The attorney I described, Don Wallace, was her attorney for 25 years, and during that time never met her, handled all of her business. And he spoke to her on the phone or through the door. So clearly she had some social disabilities, but we didn't try to put a name on that or a label on that, and it didn't feel to me that it was our place to do that. Another question? Yes. Yes, we have several in the book. This is a self-portrait. She was well trained as an artist. She attended Miss Spence's school in New York City on the Upper East Side, and had an artistic education. A professional painter, was her daily painting instructor for more than a decade. And we have several of her paintings are in the book. Paintings of Japanese women, the self-portrait, and there's a beautiful scene out of a window, which I think I can find. Yeah, here. This This is a scene from her window on Fifth Avenue. There's a delicate Japanese lamp in the foreground with a Japanese woman in a kimono shyly hiding her face with a fan. This is looking south on Fifth Avenue toward the Empire State Building and the RCA building. And it's snowy and misty outside. It's cold. It's foreboding outside, and it's warm inside the window. No, this painting is still in her. There was an auction at which her jewelry was sold after she died. The paintings that she made will go to the foundation in California. The other fine paintings that she owned will be sold. Ones not created by her will be sold to raise money for the estate. Yes. So the New Canaan property is still available if you'd like to buy it. Pardon me? Well, so that money sort of goes into the estate. In other words, the sums that are being distributed to everybody are dependent on some estimates of how much the IRS may or may not charge in penalties and how much they'll get for selling that house or these paintings. So who knows how long it'll take to sell. Barbara, are you here? Barbara Cleary's the realtor. And no, a subdivision was approved a few years ago, and so the purchaser has the opportunity or the option of subdividing it, but it hasn't been broken up at this point. In other words, someone could buy it whole and use it as and keep all 52 acres, or someone could buy it and sell off a few lots. There wasn't a near purchase back in the spring. Someone who made an offer that was accepted, but then wasn't able to get the financing together. And so it's still on the market. It's now at 15, I believe, 15 million. It's a steal. Yeah, we'd have to sell a lot of books, I think, to be able to buy it. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that the cost for her hospital was $400,000 a year. Do you have any idea what sort of other expenses were?
Yes. Yes, there's a table in the back of the book that takes a 3-year period after she moved into the hospital, 91 to 94, and it lays out per month what she was spending. And, you know, the California property was costing her about $40,000 a month. The property taxes in Connecticut were $161,000 a year. You know, her total monthly costs for health care, property managers, taxes, storage, the lawyer, the accountant, everything was at that point about $350,000 a month. So it's pretty much the same as your budget, right? Yes, 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 ma'am. No, we describe in the book what happened. The father's property essentially, the businesses were essentially sold off after he died, and so she had investments. You know, she had treasury bills that rolled over. She had blue chip stocks. She had her fine art and paintings and her properties, and she bought things that did well. One thing to remember is that she didn't get all of her father's money. She got 1/5 of it. Four children from the first marriage, and she shared equally in the estate. So, to put it another way, the relatives who were seeking her inheritance had already gotten theirs. Yeah. Yes, ma'am, in the back. She sold her best Strad for $6 million. It's said to be the finest Stradivarius violin in the world that's not in the British Museum. And she sold that to a private collector who still has it, and who allowed it to be played on a CD that you can buy online. And then she gave her second best Strad to her nurse, And she had two others, which I think she still owned when she died. And she had other musical instruments, the Steinways and others. Yes. The question is, why did the purchaser of the violin have to sign a promise not to disclose for 10 years from whom he bought it? And it raised a great deal of suspicion in my mind. I was thinking of my mother, who was in her 80s, and I was thinking, well, would she sell something valuable that she'd owned for 50 years? No, not unless she was broke. So that made me very suspicious. And then the gag order, or the confidentiality agreement, made me suspicious that it was not to protect her privacy, but was instead to keep her from knowing that her violin had been sold. And the district attorney in New York City had the same thought. It seems clear that there's correspondence where she signed off on the sale. She was very upset that it didn't fetch $10 million, which she thought it was worth. She clearly knew that it was sold and had authorized its sale. So, you know, the desire for privacy was so great that things that you would think of as must have some other nefarious reason, time and time again came out to be caused by that desire for privacy. We tell in the book about one of her Degas paintings that was stolen out of her apartment while she was in the hospital, a $10 million painting. And it showed up on the wall of a collector in Kansas City who had bought it in New York, apparently honestly, bought it from a dealer. And she didn't sue to get it back, because suing to get it back would attract attention and invade her privacy. And in the same, you know, if she hadn't put this house in New Canaan up on the market, I wouldn't have stumbled into her, and we wouldn't have, I don't think, known much of this. Another question. Yes, ma'am, in the very back. Yeah, that's you. She played the violin. Her mother played the harp. Her sister played the harp. She played the violin. When she gave the second best Stradivarius to her nurse, the nurse said, well, she said, it's for your son who plays. And the nurse said, well, he doesn't play anymore. He used to play when he was a child. You get remembered that he had played. But the nurse said, he doesn't play now. And you get said, oh, well, you know, my mother made me practice. You know, he'll pick it up again. Yes, ma'am. Well, she has a French accent because she was born in Paris. She was born in 1906 in Paris, while her mother was over there studying the harp. And so if you think about the politics of it, while her father was serving in the United States Senate, he announced that he had gotten married 3 years earlier and had a 2-year-old daughter. That's Huguette's older sister. John Edwards has nothing on W.A. Clark. And so both girls spent their early childhood in Paris until her sister was 8 and Huguette was 4, and then they moved into this house in New York City on Fifth Avenue, 121 rooms, 31 bathrooms, a railroad spur under the house to bring in coal for the furnaces. Yes. Yes. She signed 2 wills. We go into this. There's a whole chapter about the 2 wills in the book, and to my mind, that's something that raised questions, but I think it's adequately explained in the book. She had promised her nurse a $5 million gift, and she signed that will to give the nurse the $5 million gift, and that's why there was an earlier will. The family has said, oh, well, we were going to get all the money from that will. Well, but they're not named. What it says in that will is I give $5 million to the nurse, and everything else goes to whoever would get it if I didn't have a will, which is the family, but it's not dear nephew John. But you know, a settlement in this case probably made some sense, because you would have had on one side the defenders of the will, the beneficiaries, making a case that she was lucid, and that the beneficiaries were right in line with her wishes, the people she had given money to all through her last 20 years, and or longer, and the people she'd corresponded with. And on the other side, you would have had the family saying, oh, the hospital pestered her for gifts. Well, there was no evidence that they influenced the will, but that would have looked bad. The family succeeded in getting a page one story in the New York Times all about those hospital pestering them for gifts. Good pretrial strategy. And they would have said, oh, but there were 2 wills. And oh, the accountant's a felon. And oh, the attorney and the accountant are in the will. And so what you would have had is a jury trying to decide. The trial would have taken about 8 weeks, and it would have burned up about $100,000 a day in legal fees. And so they settled.
You were a little disappointed in how it came out with
No.
the relatives getting anything?
No, I wasn't disappointed. The way it worked out is that the relatives got $34 million. And I didn't have a horse in the race. I was surprised as we worked on the book to find that their claim that she didn't have a charitable bone in her body, that she was mentally ill, doesn't seem to, there was no evidence of any of that. She was charitable all through the years, and as was her family. And so I found that they didn't have much evidence to back up their claims. But that's not the same as recognizing that they had plenty of dust they could have kicked up at a trial. And there would have been a lot for a jury to say, I don't know. And so it wasn't a sure thing that either side would win at trial. So maybe a settlement made sense.
Well, living in a hospital for 21 years when you have Fifth Avenue.
And we explain in the book why she lived in the hospital. She felt more safe there. And she'd had an intruder at her apartment. There were reasons that she was no longer. But it really, I think, went back to her social disabilities. She was not comfortable with new people. Her staff had died. And so she was rattling around by herself in 42 rooms with a Monet and a Manet and a Cezanne and a Renoir. And she's having an intruder. And she didn't like nursing homes, which I'm not sure makes you crazy. Yeah, this man here has been raising his hand.
I seem to recall in one of the reviews of your book, there was speculation that her increasing inclusiveness may have been due to her skin cancer, which was getting worse and debilitating. Can you go into that?
I didn't see, I spoke with people who knew her, and they didn't buy the idea that she was disfigured in such a way that she had skin cancer, she got it repaired. She had put off some of the cosmetic surgery because she didn't want to go home, her doctor said. He suspected she was putting it off because she wanted to stay there. But it doesn't seem that she was disfigured in some hideous way that would have explained her not, she was reclusive. It seems the reclusivity, for whatever reason, was something she shared with her mother. Her mother married a U.S. senator but didn't want the social things, as he put it, didn't want the society life that came along with being a senator's wife. And grew up in this magnificent house on Fifth Avenue that was flung open every weekend for the public to come in and tour the 5 art galleries and the senator's art collection. And they had fundraisers at the house all the time. It was a very public upbringing. She was a debutante. She was in the newspapers whenever she threw a little party for her friends at a restaurant. It was a very public, her engagement was in Walter Winchell's column in 2000 newspapers. But after the senator died, the younger wife and the daughter stayed at home and pursued what they wanted to do, their art, their music, their charity, their correspondence, their friends, their godchildren, sponsoring chamber music groups, etc., and not a public life. But I think the idea of saying, oh, her reclusivity was caused by something that happened to her in 1991 doesn't begin to explain the 50 years of quietude that preceded that. Yes, ma'am. No, she wasn't an orphan, but at Huguette's death, there were no survivors on the mother's side, if that's what you're getting at. There was a family story about the mother being the ward, her father had died, and we dispense with those pretty clearly in the book. Yes, sir.
Have they decided who's going to star in the movie yet?
Well, my co-author Paul is a spitting image of his great uncle, so he could play W.A. Clark. We haven't cast Huguette yet. Meryl Streep can play. She can play anything. So I won't be shocked if something works out along those lines. Can you wait about 10 days and then ask me that question? All right. Yes.
I was wondering, they moved her to a real drabby room from the hospital room that she was in the book. Did they do that before she completed her second will, the last will? Remember, they moved her to the
Yes.
room without a view, they keep showing the picture.
I've shown you the picture of the view from her apartment and the view from her. I took this picture for the view from her hospital room.
Right. Then she left them $1 million instead of what they were all expecting. And I'm wondering if that, in your mind, we wouldn't know, but if she left $1 million instead of, I wonder if that had any effect on her, that we might not know that, but she only gave them a small amount of money. She didn't seem to complain about it and said nothing about it. At least in the book, you don't show any disappointment.
She sort of she didn't seem that interested in the view. She kept windows. I'm going to show you some more pictures from Le Beau Chateau is what I'm going to switch to here. She kept the shades closed, but not all the time, but much of the time. And she didn't seem. This is just some raw photos from inside the house, but I think they're going to cycle through. Are they going to cycle through? Maybe. I don't know. We leave the reader to decide. I mean, we don't know if the hospital was punishing her for having left them a little money in the will. We don't know if the hospital was even aware of what had been left in the will. And we don't know what effect moving to that lesser room had on her. There are a variety of ways in the book where we tell the reader what we know and what we don't know, and the reader has to piece it together. Yeah, and as we describe in the book, one of those really nice places is named for one of the men who'd been soliciting gifts from her, but she wasn't in those really nice places. Over here, there was a hand. No? Yes?
Yeah, was his father, was he connected with any of the big corporate companies like Anaconda or Endicott, or was he on his own?
He was the opponent of the Anaconda Copper Company in Montana. So his Clark companies, his biggest mine was not in Montana. His biggest mine was a United Verde mine in Arizona, in Jerome, Arizona, and he built a company town called Clarkdale, which was producing in 100 years ago between $5 and $10 million a year in profit out of that single mine, the largest copper mine in the world. But he really, his copper mines more of them were in Montana, and he and the Anaconda Company were in a battle for control. There's a section in the book about Mark Twain. Many of you have read a quotation where Mark Twain derided W.A. Clark as no one sent him to the United States Senate who doesn't know that he should instead be in a ball and chain. There's a section in the book where we describe how Mark Twain, well, put it another way, Samuel Clemens was rescued from bankruptcy by the Standard Oil man who was W.A. Clark's opponent, who was trying to take over W.A. Clark's businesses in Montana, drive down the price. And W.A. Clark had never profited from stock manipulation, but Samuel Clemens did in the copper. And it's entirely possible that his wallet Samuel Clemens's wallet was doing the talking for Mark Twain in his derision of Clark, which helped solidify his reputation. Yes, ma'am. This is the last question. Then I'll let you ask, and then I'm going to go to the back and we'll sign some books. Yes, he was thrown out of. He resigned from the U.S. Senate ahead of being thrown out after he had bribed members of the legislature. There was certainly evidence that men had gone to the legislature poor and had finished the term wealthy. And there's an entertaining episode in the book in which, after he resigned, the governor of Montana was tricked out of the state, so the lieutenant governor could appoint a successor to Clark, who was Clark. So you can read in the book how when Clark was forced to resign, he was replaced by himself. It really was one of the great political episodes, I think, in American history. The 17th Amendment, which gave the vote of senators back to the people as opposed to legislators, didn't come solely from that episode in Montana, but the episode in Montana was one of the primary examples used to lead to that. Yeah. Thank you all for your attention. I'd like to very quickly say 3 things before we go. First, there might be errors in the book. And if anybody knows it, it'd be the folks in this room. And so if you see something in the book that's not true, don't just say, oh, darn, but let me know so we can fix it, because we're printing more books. I'd like to commend to you the audio book, because you can hear Paul and you get conversations. So if you had a book club and you were reading the book, get 1 copy of the audio book so you can play it on a tablet or an iPhone or something so everybody can hear it. I think it would add to a discussion and to your understanding of the book. Well, we quote from those conversations in the book, but I think hearing them is a different matter. And we have a website with more videos and photos and such, and I'll give you that address. It's emptymansionsbook.com. Empty Mansions is a rock band. You don't want their website. emptymansionsbook.com has more information about the book. Thank you all for your attention. We're going to go in the back.